Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see lots of you here. Can I just find out who came to the last panel that happened at 2:30? Okay. Oh wow. Okay, fantastic. Okay, and who came to the panel at 12? Love it. Okay, well done on your dedication. 10 out of 10. It's great that you're still here, and I'm really excited about this panel. It's a brilliant way to finish this first day of the festival. So we're going to be talking about who gets to imagine the future. What brings us here today? What brings us here this afternoon? We've had 2 panels already today. The first looking at poverty in the UK today, exploring the experience of poverty, exploring some of the statistics and the issues around it. And we've also had a panel exploring the possibility of another world. This panel follows on very beautifully, I think, from those 2, where we're going to start exploring this question of whose voices are shaping the future, who gets to imagine the future. And there are obviously lots of people imagining the future already, and in fact in the last panel one of the things we talked about is we all are born with imagination. We can all imagine our futures. But the futures that are being enacted are often coming from the imaginations of those places where power is concentrated. So companies with large R&D budgets, Silicon Valley, government, and so on. And I think there is a question about whether those visions are really the ones that we want to be shaping the lives of our children and our grandchildren. So in this panel, we want to explore more about the voices that are not being heard and what we need to do about that. And I think sometimes when we talk about imagination, who gets to imagine the future, it's sometimes imagination is seen as this kind of this tool of innovation. And actually, I think what we might get to on this panel is that actually it's something much more fundamentally human than that. That actually imagination is really about liberation. It's about the freedom for every human being to be able to dream their future and for their voices to shape those futures. So I'm sure we'll get into that more with our panel. I'm so happy that we're joined by this amazing group of people. We have Amahra Spence. Amahra is the founding director of the Maya Group, which is an organisation that works with artists to build new worlds and rehearse liberation into being. She's guided by lineages of Black imagination, spatial justice, and more than human accountability. So I'm sure you'll say more about all of that in a minute. We also have Roseanna and then Lukus at the end there. They are the co-founders of Unearthed. Unearthed is a community-rooted initiative that they created to imagine new futures with rural communities. And they're going to talk a bit more about that as well in a minute. And last but definitely not least, Steve Arnott. Steve is a hip-hop MC from Hull and the founder and CEO of the Beats Bus Records. And he's worked with lots of young people in deprived communities from around Yorkshire and the Humber using hip-hop as a tool to liberate people's dreams. So it's really great to have you all here. Just before we start then, we did this at the beginning of the last session, and I'd like us to kind of get into that space of thinking about the future again. I want to ask you, at the last session we talked about imagining a York in 2033, so in 10 years' time, when everything had gone right, where we'd done everything we possibly could and it had gone well, to build a future where people and planet can thrive. Some of you have done this once already, but I'm interested. Let's do it again. Talk to your neighbour. What does that York look like where we've had 10 years of everything going brilliantly? And talk to your neighbour, maybe bring into any reflections if you were at the last session about what you took from that. And we'll take a couple of minutes to do that before coming over to the panel. Off you go. I'm going to bring you back to York of 2023. So just to remind you, the last session, some of the themes that came out of those little mini conversations you've just had, which you could probably have for the rest of the hour. Someone talked about solidarity. Someone talked about a roof over everyone's head. Someone talked about tax not being a dirty word, I think was their phrase. So I'd just love to hear from a couple of you. What else is in this York of 2033 where people and planet are thriving? Who would like to share? Don't be shy. Great. You kind of have to really wave, by the way, because the lights are very bright. So
I just feel by 2033, communities have just come together. They're resilient and they've just come together, and it will be a different place, basically. And it's trying to break down those barriers, those challenges, and get the gatekeepers to listen to us, society. So yeah, it will be a great place, York, in 10 years' time.
Thank you. Yes. There's room for both of you. So let's just wait for the microphone and then everyone can hear.
We talked about two different ideas. One for the city centre, that at the moment, you know, there's the people that come in the daytime. They all go home when museums and shops close, and then the drinkers and come in, and then the homeless people bed down. So something more of a 24-hour city centre. And then I was in Poppleton last weekend. There was a village fair, and I was saying maybe there would be more villages, that local areas of York would feel more like communities and not sort of barren bungalow lands or these estates like chapel fields and places, but that there would be more going on locally.
Living, breathing communities. Thank you. Do you want to pass the microphone back? Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm imagining that in 24, 25, there's been a process in which everybody in York's had a voice to imagine what is a good and beautiful future. Great. And there's a consensus about that.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. The hands are going up now. Yes, there's two more back here. Let's take a couple more and then we'll come to the panel.
That we do a lot more sharing, including sharing houses, so that people move from house to house, because we realise that our housing stock is completely unfair and unsustainable to put some people in rubbish houses their whole lives long and other people in really nice ones.
Thank you. And then do you want to pass it? Oh. Pass the mic.
We'd like to see that all these wonderful ideas were actually being supported by local government and allowed to thrive further on than just ideas and imagination.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. And we're going to come to our panel now. Who gets to imagine the future? Amahra.
First of all, I'm so thankful to be here, and thank you for hosting this conversation, this space, because there's energy in York right now. This is my first time visiting, and I'm like, there is something in the air in York, like you lot are different, I don't know. Even these things that are coming out, the reflections from the previous conversation, there's a very palpable energy, and this is a space that I love to work in, where there's almost this infectious spirit and a yearning, like a deep, spiritual, cosmological yearning for something more than what is. I think it's already an incredible active imagination that is very present in this space, and I think the task is, how do we keep that alive? So a lot of my work really looks at, I think that we need new cosmologies. I think we need new ways of being. I think that we need these openings. One of my favourite scholars slash thinkers, Dr. Bayo Akomolafe. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Dr. Bayo's work. Do your Googles. I promise you, like, life is going to be different after this. But Dr. Bayo Akomolafe always talks about, I think the way that we are responding to the crisis is the crisis. I think our impulses, the things that come up when crisis hits, and we know we're living in this time of compounding, constant crises, and COVID was one of those moments that we could not deny the scale of that everything is so inherently tied together, that there feels like a lot to be hopeless about. And at the same time, more than ever, I saw all of these things that we're talking about, what we're yearning for, show up. And they were showing up in ways, whether local government created that resource or infrastructure or didn't, whether, you know, your next door neighbour, you'd never spoken to them before or not. There were these new relational ways of being that we said, the only way that we're going to get through this is in that deep solidarity. So a lot of my work looks at, how do you create the space for that? How do you create these openings in the everyday? Because we also know that crisis is permanent, crisis is constant and it's compounding all of the time. And if we don't experience it, if we don't feel the fullness of that in our everyday, someone very proximate to us is. So how do we act as though we know that to be the truth? My work is really interested in culture. Right? I'm really interested in the futures that we're yearning for. This is more than a spatial thing, it's more than a political thing, it's a philosophical thing, it's a cultural thing, it's a societal thing. So what are the cultural spaces, what are the cultural types of infrastructures that we as people need to gather together, that we need to co-develop, that we need to really ideate into being, because that's where we're going to practice what does solidarity look like to the people of York? What does solidarity look like to my tiny neighbourhood in the city of Birmingham, one of the sexiest cities in the world? What does solidarity actually look like? The only way we're going to figure that out is practice, because we might have these utopian ideas, right? I should have started this with, I am an artist, I am a performing artist, and I think in the way that we talk about, we live in the time of somebody's imagination, right? We live in a time where imagination has created war, and it has created borders, and it has created climate collapse and all of these other things, and it has also created jazz. It has also created hip-hop. I'm so glad you're here, my brother. It's created hip-hop. It's created these openings of resistance in the everyday. It's created poetry in our very being. It created mutual aid. How do we make that the everyday? The only way we do that is rehearsing that into being. And I'll probably shut up now because there's loads I want to say, but I'm really excited.
Thank you. So Roseanna, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Amahra, for setting us up. I think where my and Lukus' practice sits is also in creating these rehearsal spaces, or spaces where we might come together to have different conversations that cross demographics and cross issues, because we can find that often people come together in a space, there might be an agenda and it might be focused on one issue. So how do we get around that? So we both worked on a project called Unearthed. We are releasing a green print with the findings from a UK-wide tour that we did. We travelled to 14 different locations across the UK, from the Western Isles of Scotland through to post-industrial towns in South Wales and community farms in Northern Ireland. We went all over last year, inviting communities in rural settings to come together and spend an afternoon or a morning thinking about and exploring what our future relationship to land might be. And what we found was this lens of land and our connection to it was a really powerful invitation for bringing a wide variety of people into that space. We noticed that we often had people who were active in the community already who would come along, so they felt comfortable and confident to be in that space of an emergent conversation without necessarily an agenda, something a bit more exploratory. We also felt like we were speaking to the people who could afford to take that time out to come together and imagine and spend time with other people in their community. And actually what we felt we weren't able to do was bring in decision makers or people who hold a lot of power in those communities. We had a bit of that, but not a lot. Also people who actually own the land, and also people who are working the land, in particular farmers. It was few and far between the farmers that were in those spaces, and they were a huge part of the conversation. So there's something in that around this work that we did was very much about the breadth of like what's happening across the UK. How can we kind of join up some of these pockets of imagination, and what happens when we do that? So it's very much a breadth approach. Our work generally is very depth focused and very place based. So this was a challenge for us, you know, and I think one of the things that came out was the need for spending more time in communities to build those relationships and bring those decision makers in, bring those farmers in, and also the importance of resourcing people actually to do this kind of imagining together. Having said that, I think that the spaces that we created within the workshops, which were very much focused on taking people on a journey from their individual kind of imaginings through various creative activities to then build a collective imagination map and a kind of action plan, but not really like what's the next step kind of thing. That process of having space held for you in your community, actually the feedback was that was so important, and it was so rich, and the fact that we weren't coming in with an agenda, that we were enabling the people who came to that space to set the agenda and to set the direction of what it was they wanted to explore and going where the energy is. And, you know, what really came out of that, I suppose, was that imagining together is a practice, and it's a muscle that we need to, like, practice together, and it's through that we start to build solidarity, not around single issues, but around our shared hopes and dreams, of which, you know, we're going to talk a bit about that. There was lots of evidence that there's a lot of shared, you know, it's this human universal dream of liberation and of connection to land that was really at the heart of so many of our conversations. And so, yeah, that need for space, that need for infrastructure, that need for expertise that is also shared in communities so that they are resourced to do this work, to hold this space themselves. That is something that we've worked on in the Green Print and have really tried to share the process and the practice with people so that they can also do that in their local places. And it's all under what's called a Creative Commons license, so it's all usable, adaptable, however you want to, you know, use it. It's for the people. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this point about imagining together as a practice, it's very interesting to think about that alongside democracy and the experience we have of particularly local democracy. So maybe that's something we might come back to. And the other thing I need to say is Roseanna and Lukus are both here, which is wonderful. I'm not leaving Lukus out. It's just that they're sharing the talking between them, so we have time for questions as well. So, yeah, you will hear from Lukus in a little while, but not right now. So it's over to Steve.
Hi everyone, I'm Steve. I just want to start by saying I do have a stoma bag, so if you hear any funny noises while I'm speaking, I don't know when it's going to go off, so please forgive me. I'm a hip-hop artist from Hull. People ask me, where is Hull, all the time. I say it's just near Leeds. So, I am a founder of Beats Bus Records. There's a couple of things to Beats Bus Records that we do. Firstly, we took a lorry, a 7.5-ton lorry, and turned it into a mobile recording studio so we can visit estates and communities in Yorkshire and the Humber where young people don't usually have access to arts and the music industry. I realised this because we used to run a lot of workshops that was very central based in Hull, and Hull is quite high in poverty, so we realised that the parents couldn't give the young people the money to travel to the town centre all the time to be involved in the workshops. So we thought, right, we need to create something where we can take the arts and the music to them rather than them having to travel to us. So that's why we created the mobile recording studio. We also run a free mentorship for young people aged 8 to 30, and we teach them all the elements of hip-hop as well as the values of hip-hop and the one love mentality of hip-hop, which is anybody's welcome. As long as you're prepared to learn and learn new skills, then you're welcome into the hip-hop culture, and we called it a one love mentality. The reason we set up Beats Bus was because when I was younger, my family had nothing, and I really inspired to be a hip-hop artist. From being like 9 years old, I wanted to be a hip-hop artist, but I never had any funds or any money for studio time, for creating music videos, to create music. So we decided that we wanted to break down these financial barriers for young people and offer all our services for free. So they don't have to worry about, how are we going to be able to pay to make a song? How are we going to be able to pay to make a music video? So we break down all them barriers by offering our services for free, and we empower the young people by getting them to create their own ground rules, getting them to create their own rules by which they work with. And it's just magical. Instead of us saying, okay, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, they create within themselves what they can and can't do within the sessions, and that really empowers them. Lately, I've been working in pupil referral units, PRUs. So the young people in these places just get poured on with stigma. We have people leading them into the room and saying, these are the worst kids here. We have people leading into the room and saying, don't bother with him because he's not really going to be able to do anything. But when we empower them and give them belief and tell them, you are able to do this, you are brilliant, you are amazing, it just totally changes the dynamics. And at the end of it, I have the teachers from the PRUs saying to me, how did you do that? And the only answer is, I gave them belief. You know, I empowered them. I told them they was brilliant. I told them what they was good at, not telling them what they're not good at and what they can't do. I told them what they are good at and what they can do. So that kind of brings me to my first thought or question, really. Who created these places? Who had the power to imagine to create these places where they put a load of children in there and tell them they're no good? How do they expect these children to learn or develop when the people who are housing these children are telling them, nah, you can't do it? So, yeah, reimagining, you know, I don't know who imagined these places, and whoever did imagine these places needs to be reimagined themselves, I think. So, so yeah, what we've realised is young people don't fit into these systemic boxes that are created for them. So they need to have alternative ways of being able to show their talent and use their imagination. So we've come to the conclusion that we're going to try and create an alternative provision called the Hip Hop School of Excellence. And this is going to be for young people who have been expelled from school or don't academically make the grade at school. And we want to take them and give them the power to reshape themselves and develop themselves. And then 3 outcomes, really. They can either go back into education with the qualification from our school, they can either be a self-sufficient artist in their own right and make a career in the arts and music industry, or they can become an apprenticeship with Beats Plus Records and work alongside us. So that's it.
Thank you so much, all of you. And I want to come back to, all of you are working really with people's hopes and dreams. You're opening new spaces for people together to think about what their futures might look like. And it'd just be really great to hear a little bit from all of you about what is it that people are dreaming of? What are these futures that people are wanting to move towards? Or as Rob Hopkins in the previous panel talked about, creating longing for these futures. So I'm interested, what's coming through? Are there themes and patterns? And maybe Lukus, will come to you.
Yeah. Thank you. So we visited 14 different communities, and the lens that we were using was land. And for us, being in a rural setting, we both normally work in Bristol, so it's really nice to be out in the countryside. And there were a lot of themes that were sort of geographically connected to that space, but then also connected to other spaces when we started going deeper with the work. So we were imagining 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, 50 years, 100 years, and trying to push for 200 years. So we developed a practice that would allow people to bring their own individual imaginations and then start building that collective imagination together with members of the community that were probably doing that work but not connected. And for us, we measured the work on critical connection, not critical mass. For us, it was about this stuff is already happening in communities. You know, people have deep understanding, deep connection to their landscape, deep wisdom with their landscape, and they're already doing this work. They just don't have the resource, or they're not connected to their person down the road who's doing a similar thought or doing a similar thing and has a certain skill that might actually enable certain things to happen. Because we were in a rural setting, obviously the connection to farming, to food production, to localised food production came through quite a lot. But the other thing that came through quite a lot was the holistic connection to land. And part of Unearthed was that we wanted to also be a voice for nature within that conversation. So it's not just about creating or recreating new systems for us in the future. It's also who's thinking about nature when it comes to that. If we are looking at localized food systems, if we are looking at developing different styles of housing where resources are locally sourced rather than bringing in non-sustainable produce or things from far away, what have we got around us? What can we work with? Who can we work with? Who's on our street? How do we start building that? And we're starting with food. It then was like, well, we've got localized food. If everybody in this community is able to have access to food from the local community, what else can happen with that? So, everybody gets access to a little bit of nature, getting soil on your hands, getting that good bacteria in your body. That also can help our mental health and physical health and all of those kind of things. So it was trying to expand on those ideas. We were with each community for a day, which is really unusual for us. So to build that level of trust and build that level of understanding in a short space of time was difficult, but we worked with local community champions who were already doing this work with communities, and we built that trust, and we kind of framed our work to allow for that trust to be built upon as the work grew. It was an evolving practice. As Roseanna said, there was no agenda. We didn't go with an agenda. We went with an open mind to create a huge map for each community, and then we started mapping this community in the future, which was amazing to see where communities were going with their imagination together collectively, and where the energy was and what people were most concerned about. So it was housing, it was in relation to what's happening right now, and I'm really trying to go deeper with that work. And so that's where we were at. In the short time frame we were with the communities, we realised there's a lot of work going on already, and it's incredibly, pretty powerful.
Great, thank you. Steve, what about you in your work? What are the dreams and hopes that you hear from the young people and the kids?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people, young people just want to be who they want to be without being stigmatized, without being told you can't be this, you can't be that. They want the freedom and they want the power to be who they want to be, not what society wants them to be.
Thank you.
So poetic. And that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Just picking up on some of the threads that you've all shared. I think one thing that I didn't say was a lot of our work really speaks to the Black imagination, and we're trying to uncover what do we mean when we think about the Black imagination. What if we were to think of Black not in the connotations that it currently holds, but as synonymous with freedom? What is that type of imagination, and what does that type of imagination require? And the biggest thing that we're talking about, because it cultivates this practice of love, because it cultivates this sense of unity, and not in like this kumbaya kind of everything is hunky-dory, like we've cracked all the problems, but in a way that leads to deep humility, and that humility becomes a starting point for what is it, like what do we need to move through, what are the wounds that we're carrying with us, how does that stigma land on us, and how are we carrying the pain of that with us in our everyday, and how is it then showing up in our communities, like between us? So there's so much that we're like trying to unpack at the same time as creating space for that joy and the love and the dreaming and the hope, but it always comes back to I just want to be myself, and for that to be the case, I want time to work out what it is to be myself. And that's the biggest thing I think about culture is it helps you break down some of those veils. It helps you get to the root of you, not as some like fixed and finished thing, but as a constant becoming, and that culture almost gives us permission to be a constant becoming. So our thing is we say, what Lukus said, this idea that so much is already happening in communities. I work mostly in and around Birmingham, but we work in a lot of other cities as well. And there's this idea that the expertise, the radical imagination exists in these communities already. They just call it survival. Well, we say, well, what is it that you need to survive? Because the main thing is they're like, this dreaming stuff that you talk about, if I use dreaming language, they're like, I'm not into that. I haven't got time for contemplation. What is that? Do your dreaming stuff over here. And I say, oh, all the things that you do to survive, that's the radical imagination, like that's where it lives. Now we say, how can we create capacity so that it goes beyond survival? What would you actually need to thrive? And because of the layers of harm that are done to our, black communities, migrant communities, queer communities, disabled communities, children, because of all of these communities are constantly erased from societal imagination, the only way that we do this is through practice. So one of the things that we were looking at was the way that carcerality, the way that punishment has become an impulse in our society. And we designed something called Art School, where we take these kind of systemic lenses, or these more systemic sort of concepts in the world, and we explore what that means, or what a more liberatory approach to these things could be through art and culture. And the first art school that we did was Imagine a World Without Prisons, because it feels like where and how do we get to have these really difficult conversations? Where do we get to have the space where we unpack things that flag up all of the inner contradictions in us? That some people are like, now we need prisons, and then some people are like, nope, like get rid of the prisons. Like, where do we have space for generative conflict, generative debate? And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, is how all of us are creating those spaces to go through that hard labor lovingly through culture. I've got so many things to say. One last thing that you've also touched on is our communities are craving a more than human cosmology, a more than human set of accountabilities, because not only are we in this time of climate crisis, and it's having immediate effects all around the world right now, that in the West we're becoming more privy to, but it's happening all of the time. We also know that our communities are longing for a framing that includes our ancestors in a deeply spiritual and political way. Where do we make space for this ancestral wisdom, this generational learning, this generational healing, because there's so much pain in that. But critically, the way that we understand what it is to be human right now in this time is so subjective that people aren't afforded humanness in this paradigm. These kids who are ostracized, who are put into these spaces, our working class communities who are put into these spaces or these categories, our queer people who are put in these categories, like so many of us, we're not allowed the rights, the freedom, the ability to be human. So what our people are actually calling for is a more than human philosophy.
Thank you, Amahra. And actually, it makes me want to come to you, Steve. So Steve, as well as all of the work that he does through Beats Bus, is also part of a stigma co-design group. So it's a big project we're running at JRF, but it's held by the co-design group to explore the impact of stigma on people's lives and the impact of stigma on people's lives when they're in poverty. And that is obviously such a factor in people's ability, sense of liberation, ability to be able to imagine, to be able to move through some of what you've described there, Amahra, around the kind of trauma, the need to heal from that. So Steve, maybe you could say a little bit about stigma and how that relates to imagining.
I've been working with some amazing people from the Poverty and Stigma Research team, and whilst we've been working, I've kind of like drifted off into my own little world, and I've wrote a spoken word piece that I'd like to deliver for you now, and it's just me trying to say, how can we change things? So I've only done it a couple of times, I'm a bit nervous, so please bear with me. Poverty, how do we tackle it? We need to speak to the people that constantly battle it. How do they live with stigma? How do they move? Did they have the tools to try and manage the abuse? Tramp, dosser, scrounger, you live on benefits. All this blame and anger, who does it benefit? Systemic boxes pushed into by the big machine. Design policies to keep the poor underneath. Narrative shift, we need to challenge current designs. Paradigm shift, how does it look from the outside? Awareness lift, we need to understand people's lives. Repair the rift. It's time for us to wrong the rights. Start at the roots. Where is the heart of the problem? Forbidden fruit seems the government builds upon them. We need to educate the next generation, give them power to start conversations with those in the ivory towers. Be with, share with, stand strong with each other. Suffer with, hurt with, compare with your sisters and brothers. Change with, create with, compassion and unity. Conversate with, relate with, eradicate with the power of we. It's true, you see. We grew up in poverty, so what that is the place I belong or where you want to keep me. Resilience, self-taught to combat stigma. How do you figure system creators achieve what they deliver? We can blame him, we can shame him, but don't entertain him. Do not amplify his voice. We don't want things changing. Working class, I am a model of oppression. Coming last, a social given position, not intention. So stigma, you can keep your oppressive till we've had enough. Identity is ours. We are the diamonds in the rough. Your ignorance degrading. Don't turn that on us. It's time your power faded. Reclaiming is a must. There is a saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names won't hurt me. That is not true though. Your stigma's down and dirty. Let's start with colonisation, stigmatisation of all other nations, controlling their salvation, built-in racism for defamation. Stigma sucks. It's time to deframe your class creation, dehumanisation. We say no more, we demand emancipation. Be with, share with, stand strong with each other. Suffer with, hurt with, compare with your sisters and brothers. Change with, create with, compassion and unity. Conversate with, relate with, eradicate with the power of we. Yeah. So yeah, you know, we've been working a lot, and I didn't realise how damaging stigma was until I actually started doing the research with this team, and I got backed down by stigma all my life growing up. You know, a lot of these things, tramp, dosser, scrounger, all of them things. I went to a school where uniform had to be worn every day. Some days I'd go to school with a note saying, I'm sorry my son is in jeans and trainers because I only had one uniform and the uniform was getting washed. I thought that was really cool, but it wasn't to everybody else. It was just more ammunition for bullying and stigma. So, yeah. Stigma is just something that really needs to be gone and let our people live in peace.
I really appreciate that in this conversation we're really bringing in like imagination. It's not just about joy and fun, it is about really leaning into these things that get in the way, giving people space to heal together as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. We're going to come to questions in a minute, but just before so you can start gathering your thoughts, but just before we do that, I wondered, Lukus, if there's anything you'd like to add to this question of what gets in the way of people being able to imagine a future?
I mean, we're all pretty aware of the realities of how things are for a lot of people at the moment, some more than others. And as we talked about, you know, having time to be in a room to imagine the future, having time off work. It was a real challenge for us to bring people in a space where there was no hierarchy. So we had decision makers or landowners within a room with people from the community, and it was up to us as facilitators to make sure that those voices were heard equally. And the realities of the day-to-day, you know, there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of grief in this world right now. And for people to be in a space to take a moment from their reality to try and get to a future that's hopeful collectively is a real challenge. It's a real challenge because it's a really messed up world right now for a lot of people. And it becomes really difficult when hope is constantly smashed down by things that are happening from powers above us. So the collective side of it, where you can work with the communities, as we saw during COVID, you know, communities came together, like really came together, and did things quite radically when people were failing us above that. So, you know, there's a lot of the realities of the day-to-day that are really sort of suppressing imagination and reframing it into something else, you know. What if it's this, or what if it's that? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to your neighbour? And how do we get there? What are those seeds that we can hold right now collectively, that we can plant now, that we can see start growing in 5 years' time? That's realistic. But what can we do in our own power, in our own community, that will allow us to get to something in 5 years? And what does that do? What happens then? Yeah.
Roseanna, do you want to add?
Yeah, I guess that practicing holding the grief and the anxiety and the tension and the conflict, and to what extent we are, as communities or as groups, comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, I think we want to feel safe, we want to feel comfortable, and often that means that we stay within a certain comfort zone. Maybe we don't share our innermost desires, because to do so can be fearful, can bring fear. So how do you create spaces where we have that fluency and that trust to be able to share those things, and through that build solidarity? And I think one of the way we started the workshops was through, we asked people to bring an object or a sound or an image, basically a story, about a veiled story, about what brought them hope for the future. And people shared the most beautiful stories, the most diverse objects and photos and videos and all kinds of things. But that really presented a beautiful way in to opening up this conversation about, well, what is it that is in our deepest desire, you know, like Amahra's talking about, and how does culture, how does storytelling, how does creativity enable us to meet each other in different ways, like sharing your poem. Just thank you so much, Steve. It was just absolutely beautiful. You know, how does culture, how does storytelling and creativity actually enable this opening up of ourselves and the imaginative possibilities and the solidarity building that comes from that? I think that was really present in the work, yeah.
Would you like to say something?
I'll be brief because I feel a bit emotional. But I think access to physical space has become a huge, increasing thing. Access to land in all of its connotations. I live in a city that is currently, I mean, it's just announced its 20-year strategy for the city development, and the way that they talk about the city publicly is this great display of culture and life and conviviality, and it's like, you know, the social aspects of the best of us, and then you sift through the documents and you're like, where is this going to happen? Because all of the city is being sold off to the highest bidder, and they want to build residential, they want to build apartment blocks, they want to build student accommodation at extortionate prices, and at best will designate this shop unit for this cultural use, but will make the rent so high that they can't stay. And so that's a huge thing. Of course, money is a huge thing. It comes back to the time, you know, this time poverty is a real thing, economic poverty is a real thing, hold tight JRF. But there is this thing that's like, so at Maya, we always, we pay people above, when we're working with artists, we pay them above industry standard. When we're working with our communities, we're always trying to say, how do we get resource to you? And how can we include an expansive set of resources? So it's not just to cover your time, but your access, like how do you participate here from a place of wellness? What does that take? You've got kids, do you want us to look after your kids? Do you want somebody that you know to look after your kids and you need money for that? Do you need medication? Do you need a friend to come with you? All of those things, we're trying to say, how do we create as porous an organisation as possible, and then how do we create as porous a space as possible so that people can come in as who they are in all of their, whatever way they want to show up, that is welcome, that there is resource aside. But of course, this is getting harder for us to meet that need. It's getting harder for us to, you know, we don't have enough money now to actually do what we were doing, which was paying above standards. Everyone's energy bills and things have gone up. Just getting to tomorrow is really hard. And I think one of the critical things for that is there still needs to be people, somebody, something that holds a vision when momentum runs out, when energy is at a low, when hope runs out. And I always say I struggle with hope all the time, but when that runs out or when we're flailing, what's the thing that we can hold faith to? Like, where do we hold the faith? Who is going to hold that, or how is that held? I think that's one of the biggest things. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. I want to open it out to questions now. Questions and comments, in fact. You're welcome just to make a comment. Don't feel you need to turn it into a question. If you can raise your hands and like really clearly, because the lights are very bright. Great. Okay, we'll come to here first, and then to this side.
Thank you. Really, from the last conversation and this one of the barriers, I think, to change is how we measure success. And at the moment, there's such an emphasis on qualifications, money, or dividends to shareholders, economic growth in countries, when actually maybe if we're aiming for the wrong thing, then how are we ever going to get there? I'm just wondering what the panel would like to define success as.
Great. Okay, we'll take a few and then. Okay, so defining success, you and then you. Yeah.
When you've been talking about imagining the future, there's real vulnerability in the answer. I think everybody's shared something that's really personal, and that comes out like it took a lot of bottle to do what you did, because it does. And I just wondered, when you've been speaking with individuals and communities, has that vulnerability come through? It seems like a question of imagining the future always leads to people really baring their soul, and there's not many things that bring that out of people. But it's very optimistic and it's very hopeful all the time. There's not much negativity in there. And I just wondered how that has come across with the individuals and communities that you've spoken with.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my question is thinking about imagination. It's often something I at least associate with the curiosity and like imagination of childhood, and like what young people and youthful people have and we grow out of, or perhaps is discouraged as we work through education in school. So I kind of wondered, for Steve, who works with young people, how have you seen them encourage you to stay imaginative? But for the wider panel, perhaps if you could share your experiences of unexpected sources of encouragement on being imaginative when it very much is discouraged.
Great, thank you. Some really awesome questions there. Feel free to answer all of them if you want to, or pick one if there's one in particular. But Steve, maybe do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. From the question here, I think lived experience is very important when you're teaching or when you're working with young people. It's like a lot of the time it's the people who haven't lived the lives of these young people that get to imagine how they should live. So I think when the young people realise that, this guy's been through some stuff that I've been through as well, it makes it more relatable and it builds that trust. Whereas if you've got somebody who hasn't been or hasn't lived that life, trying to tell them how to live their life and how to change their life, it's just words. There's no connection there, there's no trust there, there's no relationship there. So I think lived experience is very important when we're doing what we do. And Nikichi, sorry, what did you say? How do we keep the young people imagining?
No, how they encourage you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they're inspirational, you know. The thought that children should be seen and not be heard is ridiculous. We all need to listen to the younger generation more. You know, they're so bright, they're so amazing, they have all these ideas, so they keep me reimagining by the work that they come up with. So a few weeks ago it was Children's Mental Health Awareness Week, And the young people I work with, I've wrote a song which is on the Beats Plus YouTube, you can go to it, and it's called Please Talk More. So it's young people telling adults, talk more about your mental health issues, talk more about how you're feeling, don't bottle it up. And when a young person's telling you this, it's a lot different to when an adult's telling you this. And for me, when I hear young people speaking, you know, I pay much more attention to them than I do as if I hear an adult speaking to me. So, yeah, they inspire me, and, you know, it's an inspirational circle. It just goes round and round and round.
If I can riff off that, so I am a parent and also work. I was a youth worker before I was anything, I would say. Like, my mom was a youth worker. Like, I've been in that field for a long time, and I think this was my introduction into how do you want to see the world. And I think the beautiful thing, we're working with children at the moment. We call them yard youngers. We've got this space called Yards, and right now this week the yard youngers are teaching us deep, intimate things about grief that we could have never articulated. And it's not through something, you know, there is no workshop on grief. What we're seeing is this deep relationship with each other and the things that they care for. As an example, they encountered a bird who was really suffering, and they instantly took to this bird, right? They made a little nest. They tried to move the poor bird out the way, and they kept trying to, like, feed the bird and do all of this stuff. And just the other day, sadly, the bird passed away, and there were some really heightened emotions with this bird, right, and the loss of the bird. And, you know, we were asking these young people, what is it that you need to help you process what's happened? And so some of them were like, you know, I just want a space on my own, or I just want to do this, or can I have a hug? And what was really beautiful was seeing then these young people, and they're like 7 and 8, right, like, for context. They started to have conversations between them. They wanted their own space to process grief internally. And they were having these mind-blowing conversations. I was like, I'm here for safeguarding, and I'm not really listening. They were having these mind-blowing conversations, processing grief that was really transformative. But the biggest source of, I don't know, something for me is my granddad. I talk about my granddad any opportunity I get, Sophia knows. But my granddad's house, to me, is the first precedent that I said, I want to design a life, a way of being, my relationships around the spirit of this house. My granddad's house is the most convivial, joyful space I've ever met. It's food every day, abundance, jokes, laughter, debates, reasoning, comedy, performance. It was the first cultural centre that I ever knew. And it wasn't that everything was perfect there, but there was something about how we tended to each other, that relationship, the dynamics, that his house was just really porous and open. And so I said, how do I build, one, an organisation that can hold that spirit, 2, then physical spaces that can also hold that spirit. How would we need to organise to maintain that? But then the critical thing was, when you're building that organisation, now we're contradicting some of the things that we are legally bound to as an organisation. For example, success looks like I have to report to HMRC, and success looks like positive numbers going up, and you don't want anything in the red, and, you know, your ins and outs and all of this kind of stuff. And I was having a really difficult time holding what's considered due diligence with this actually spiritual practice. So I said, if I'm an artist, can I create my own residency that tries to reconcile with this disparity? How can I reimagine what success even means for myself to then bring it into the organisation? We created this residency that said, what has accounting been throughout history? What has it been in the Black imagination? What has it been in the Indigenous imagination? How could we create our own language that tells our story of what we think success is? Because success in a due diligence sense is one story. It's just a story. It's not even real. I can move some figures around and it tells a completely different story. It's a total myth. So we said, what stories could we tell? Because even these ins and outs are boring compared to this work that we're actually doing, which is incredible and transformative, that an Excel spreadsheet could never capture. How could we actually tell a story that we love? So we developed a residency and created our own language that was at the intersection of art, design and accounting, because we know that for generations, if we look at the hieroglyphs, just their art forms, it's also a data set. If we look at all of these indigenous languages and ways of communicating data throughout time, it has been an artistic practice, so we created our own, and from there, it meant that we had to say, what are the reimagined metrics that we actually need to look at, because we don't care about the ins and outs, but we might have to tell that story sometimes. So it's not like, let's just forget that, we won't do it. We still have to do that, we know that. But there are all of these other things that we should spend as much time and attention on, and it doesn't have to be an either or. But I think that mental framing has created massive capacity in our organisation.
Tell us some of the metrics. I don't know. I think
we've got
some of them.
We had to design like all of these things. So things like how much is our work advancing the Black imagination, which is why we had to define it. How much is our work moving forward more than human accountabilities? Where does love exist in this relationship? You know, how much do we tend to each other's needs? Where this money's coming from? What are the capacities it creating? Like then there were really obvious things like, you know, how many people came, which we still might need to articulate, but what's the experience that they're having, and how are they creating these feedback loops so that we know that? And what actually happened was our tools that we created, our language that we created became artifacts, they became art objects. So one artist created a board game that was a way of measuring the Black imagination advancement, and it was called In the Black Galactic. Another artist created it was like a tool that was inspired by his Angolan heritage, and it essentially was like I'll have to show you. It was two like clay mounds, and it was a beautiful artifact in and of itself, but you could like move it around and configure it and put different data in, but it created an imprint in this other piece of clay. So that in itself became an artwork that if you had the design codes, the little cheat codes here, you could read what that imprint meant. And it's that idea of actually we're trying to force ourselves out of our own imagination, and what came from that process, I'll say off the bat, it was probably the most transformative spiritual experience I've ever had in my life. It's not about the thing, it's about the process. It was the relationships, it was the love that was very present. And this sounds real cute, right? I'm very conscious, it sounds really cute. It was genuinely the most transformative thing I've ever been part of. I've been in some things, man.
Thanks, Amahra. Lukus, Roseanna, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, so off that, really, so we take a lot of inspiration from nature in our work, the patterns and the behaviours in nature, and when we were designing the workshops for Arnott, we wanted it to be an evolving process, something that could evolve and go any shape it needed to, but we needed to kind of form ways of doing that. So we used the life cycle of a mushroom. So starting with the individual spores that are all around us, these were the individual stories that people brought into a space. Then the measures of success within that were the critical connections. They would start forming the hyphae, the connection between the underground world of the mycelium, and then the measures of success for us were looking to mycelium for answers in terms of mushroom moments. So this is when all of the group were working together in a really healthy way. That there was generosity, there was kindness within this, there was food within this, there was nutrition, all of these things that allowed this network to thrive. And then there were these moments where the mushrooms came up, and these were the ideas, the little surface ideas that actually were huge, but then it would go back underground, and then it would, other things would surface as well. So we definitely take a lot of inspiration and measures of success by using sort of biomimicry of nature to guide us in growing that network. And like you say, within knowing that feedback, the metrics that some people might need to know, yes, you've got them, but also it's all part of the network that you can sort of change the shape of how you present the work as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, or should we open some questions? Okay. Any more questions? We've got time for another round. Right. Your hand was up. I'm looking for a woman to add into this round. I can't see a thing. Yes, yeah, great. Nice to see you.
I'd like to hear the panel members' thoughts on what they see as the role of established faiths and religions in getting us into our current mess, but more importantly, what that might be, and not just amorphous spirituality, but actually, recognised philosophies in terms of getting us out of the current mess.
Great, thank you.
Think of that.
Thank you. Put your hand up again, sorry. Yeah, okay, so here, and then we'll come, so here, and then here.
Hi there. Thank you so much. It's been really eye-opening. I wanted to sort of spark up some conversation about accessibility and language. I think Amahra, you especially touched on it, but I'm curious to know whether that was talking about land with communities that might not have had radical space to just think, and kind of how are you talking about systems change in a really accessible way? Because I'm conscious that as somebody who works in this world, we can leave so many people behind. And I love the way you're talking about it when we're talking about young people, and how can we use this transferable knowledge to also talk about just everybody in community.
Great, thank you.
That's great, thank you very much. So it's been really great hearing about the really inspiring work that you've been doing with all these different communities that you've been involved with. So I'm just wondering, what you then do with this in terms of how you, if you like, speak imagination to power. So what do we do with current political institutions? Is this about kind of working with those institutions, using what you're doing in order to inform politicians, for example, political leaders? Is it about kind of, to some extent, maybe even bypassing some of those institutions and looking to create new networks and new relationships within civic society? Or is this about trying to transform those political institutions? And I guess what I'm thinking is that, you've talked a lot about people in communities with imagination, but maybe we need politicians with more imagination as well.
Wonderful.
In terms of improving and reimagining society, do you think we should consider reimagining education, a new education system? I mean, I've taught in education, secondary and higher education, etc., and SEN departments. And I know sort of things you've been talking about today, as well as obviously helping pupils and students learn the STEM subjects and other the national curriculum subjects. Do you think they should be given the opportunity in this space to become good citizens and to create a better society?
What a round of questions.
I said there's energy in your boy.
Who wants to kick off?
Yeah, I'll kick off with the schooling system. I can't believe that it's never been tested since it's been created. And I think that it's important that we let young people create their own schooling system. So I know for a fact that my brain doesn't wake up till about 11:30 in the morning. So when you're asking these young people to turn up at 9 a.m, some of them haven't even had breakfast because the families can't afford to give them food. How would you expect their brain to be able to function and hit the grades and, fit in with the schooling system? It's just crazy. So, yeah, I think the schooling system should be reimagined by young people, and it should be totally turned on its head, to be honest.
So, yeah, following on from that, really, in terms of the communities and what's next, what happens next, that evolving space where I was saying earlier around communities already doing this work, have been doing this work, that imagination is rooted in resilience, has been for so many years for communities that have had to get by, had to think of how to do things differently, that the imagination is there. It needs, people, the communities don't need things done for them by people who don't live there. They need people in those communities given the power back to them to create the stuff that they know can happen. They know the land, they know what their community needs. They are part of it as on a living next door to your neighbour, but on a spiritual level of their landscape as well. We've lost that connection to that. And I think imagination and kind of bringing that step between us and them, bringing policymakers in where there is no hierarchy to really understand and find that level, because there's a real divide at the moment in a lot of different places, even from, say, farmers and environmentalists, for example. There's a real blame, who's to blame there, but actually bringing people in a room where where we can really deeply listen and support and build it up to something that's really irresistible, that people do want to be part of it, people in power do want to be part of it, where they're like, that's the way forward, you know, and communities can lead the way if they're given the opportunity. For example, when we were on the Isle of Harris, there's a community of Isle of Harris. They have 80% of their land is now community owned. They have community owned power. So any revenue they make from that community power, they then give back to the community in terms of initiatives, in terms of funding sports projects. And then there were communities that were imagining that in 100 years' time when those things are happening already. So, you know, people just need to be given an opportunity and resource to do those things, and it can clearly happen.
I wonder if I can pick up on that and also talk a bit to the systems change question that you raised around accessibility. And I think one of the things that threads through all of our work, I would say, is that this is an experiential practice. Like, it needs to be something you experience, something you embody, something that you feel. And for me, that's the way if you can get politicians, if you can get policymakers into spaces and into a position where they are able to do that deeper feeling work, that is where I think you can start to shift things. And I think it's not always accessible, actually, like inviting people in to do that feeling embodied work, and it needs to be trauma informed. At the same time, I think that is a big piece of this systems change work. We need to feel it, and feel it in collective spaces and rehearse it together. And it's through that fluency and that comfort with actually feeling quite uncomfortable a lot of the time, that can build different alternative futures and bring people into system change work in a way that's felt instead of theorized, which I think happens quite a lot of talk. And how does it translate in our lives and in ourselves?
In one of the earlier panels, Yasmin talked about this being, I think she's, I don't know if she's here, but inner work is world work.
Yes.
And it's this point.
When they are held together in that way, because sometimes I think we get so preoccupied then with the self. Like, our urgency is to go, well, somebody said I need to do my internal work, and it's like me.
And also optimization that
100%.
comes into that, which is really tough.
So it's like when the individual is held in contemplation and context with the collective is where the inner work becomes the worlding work. And I think, I was just thinking about this question about the education system, and I was like, but it's actually doing what it's designed to do, right? And actually very effectively. And if we hold the education system in parallel with the labour market and that conveyor belt, then actually it's kind of doing what it's doing. So I think the role of creating multiplicity is to say there are other ways of being human or more than human that we don't even have the space for. And that's where I think, all of our work, and there's wider work that's happening that is trying to cultivate other spaces. And, I think that we need a multiplicity of all those things. The question about, politics and politicians and what's the strategy, I think that we need a multiplicity of approaches. But I think that can only be held with integrity if I acknowledge that Maya is not one organisation trying to do all of this transformative, I'm going to try and change my local politician. Our work only makes sense in any paradigm when it is held tightly with an ecosystem of other organisations, collectives, residents, neighbours, friends, who are also trying to make a shift. And I think I feel like there's a choreography effort that's going on right now where it's like, okay, which bit of this spectrum are we, like, what's our role in this bigger spectrum? Because I would say my personal preoccupation is no longer to persuade local government that this is a tactic. However, I can only really have that approach if someone else in my ecosystem is, and I think that's something that we don't really like to talk about, but it's actually the truth. And the more that I spending time in the land space, I realise increasingly how critical that part is. So I think that we need an abundance of that, which is why the accessibility question is so important. And it's also why, you know, for us, I both hold the fact that I learnt more about systems, systemic change, a systems analysis from my grandfather, my uncles and my cousins, and from hip-hop. Those two things alone politicize me deeply. When I talk about hip-hop as a spatial critique, as a critique of its environment, as a critique of the systems that necessitated the birth of it through the birth of the projects, then that is a systems response. So I look at my community and say, all that we do as bigger society is infantilize our communities. We pretend or we make out like they don't know, they're not evolved. And it's like, no, that's where it is. And it comes back to what everybody said in the beginning. The wisdom is in the community. So it's not like we now have to dumb down our work, which is the conversation that I hear so much. How do we simplify this to make it make sense for the community? And it feels like a big translation issue of that's not even the task, you know, that's not even the task. So for us, we don't start with like systems change, we start with the feeling, but also it's like you already have a systemic analysis, you already have these conversations with your friends on the block, with your auntie, you know, with boss man in the chip shop, like you already have these conversations. So that's where we start. Oh, one more thing. But that is also underpinned by our work really centres the sort of disability justice framework, which if you aren't familiar with disability justice as a framework, that Sins Invalid created these like 10 principles of disability justice, but the central one for us is that nobody is disposable. That nobody is disposable, which means we have to root our work in a disability justice framework.
Thank you. We're coming to the end. So I'd like to make sure that everyone leaves this room feeling hope and possibility, inspiration. So I'd love just to finish, and it's kind of one sentence finishing, if you don't mind, so everyone can get off on time. What is giving you hope right now in your work and practice? Let's start.
Listening to you, actually, right now. It's hard to see hope when there's a lot of cloud, but actually hope is amongst all of us, and it's a seed. It's amongst all of us, and we can come together and help nurture those seeds. It's people.
Yeah, I think what gives me hope is the young people that I work with. You know, seeing them shine, seeing them blossom, and just giving them, when you empower them, just giving them the power to tell you how they think things are. And the children's our future, and we really need to listen to the next generation. So what comes from the young people when we're doing our workshops, that's what gives me hope for the future.
Yeah, similarly, I think the storytelling and the ways in that storytelling has to create alternative futures, and also to invite people to bear a bit more of their soul, that for me fills me with hope. And I remember all of the stories that people have shared during our workshop, and it really does like uplift me. That people have shared that part of themselves with us. So.
I think today and meeting people who are also walking this path, but because I do propositional work, so whenever I see, like, you know, these visions that we have in our minds, or these principles and things that we're longing for, when you see like the gems of it, so to see these deep relationships with these kids, or to hear how people are talking about, yo, your granddad's house sounds lit, like I now want to do this, and it could be a tiny scale or a huge one, but just seeing the everyday awe, the everyday spaces of wonder, like, yeah, mind-blowing.
Thank you. So, I hope you've had a good day. I hope you've enjoyed this session, if this is the only one you came to. And I guess the question back to all of us is, what is the York we want to create? What is the York we are going to build together? So take that away and mull it over. This is the end of the first day of the festival, and we've got there are another 2 weeks of awesome events, and I think Joan wants to say something about that in a minute. Just before I do that, though, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for being here, and a really, really huge thank you to all of you for your beautiful contributions this afternoon. Thank you.